This week on Priorities, the one simple thing states can do to improve their IT procurements. Welcome to StateScoop's Priorities podcast, where every Wednesday you'll get insights into the state and local government community and learn about the latest news and trends across the industry. I'm Colin Wood, StateScoop's editor-in-chief. Here's what's happening this week. In a letter addressed to DHS Secretary Kristi Noem last week, 21 Republican secretaries of state asked for improvements to her department's Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements, or SAVE program, so they can more easily detect non-citizens who are voting in elections. Numerous studies show that non-citizen voting is exceedingly rare. According to a recent report published by the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, state and local governments need to adopt a more whole-of-state approach to cybersecurity, involving all levels of government in policy and strategic planning in order to better protect critical infrastructure. And in recognition of the growing threats posed by artificial intelligence, a new security advisory committee in Arizona has published its first recommendations, including one to create an AI elections lab that can fine-tune election-specific AI models for use by election offices. Learn more on statescoop.com. For this episode, I interviewed Waldo Jaquith, a government delivery manager with the nonprofit US Digital Response. Before USDR, Waldo was at the US Treasury Department. He's worked for the General Services Administration, and he spent nearly 4 years at 18F and many other roles in and around government. The topic of our interview is a report published last week by USDR and the National Association of State Chief Information Officers, detailing some recent research around procurement. The report advised that states begin putting summary sheets on their requests for proposal documents, which are simply one-page documents that include the most important facts that vendors look for. It's really simple, and here's Waldo to explain how it works.
As we do at US Digital Response, as a matter of course, we started by recruiting 3 volunteers. We have over 10,000 people who've signed up to volunteer at US Digital Response, and 3 of them agreed to work on this project. So there is Shayun Adelana and Mark McGiver and Kate Drummond were the volunteer team of 3. And as is always true with USDR volunteers, these aren't like high school students looking for extra credit. These are mid to late career professionals. And it is a delight to be able to work with folks like that to turn over a project to. So they dove right in doing what they know how to do best, which is user research. We began with a survey that we put together with NASCIO, that NASCIO sent to their corporate members, with a series of questions, some broad and some specific, but really trying to understand, hey, what do you think the pain points are? What is it that you look at in the procurement process, vendors, and find unpleasant? And we got an earful. They had a whole lot to tell us, but we're able to use those survey responses to better understand the range of possibilities and the themes that we saw in the answers. So then we moved on to the interview form of user research. And so that was when the volunteer team of user researchers interviewed. They began with 4 vendors, mostly in the custom IT solution space, and just showing them a solicitation that they hadn't seen before and asking them, sharing their screen, to narrate what they're looking for. And that was eye-opening to see what it's actually like. I've only been on the government side of the fence. I have an imagined version of how people receive RFPs, but to actually watch vendor employees review it is really something. And they began with the employees at vendors, not necessarily high on the org chart, the people whose job it is to review RFPs when they first come in, to look at that slush pile and just quickly assess an RFP. Is this for us, maybe, or no? Like, what are the heuristics that they apply explicitly or implicitly to make that decision? So talking to those folks in order to narrate that was really helpful. And that is how we had hit on the underlying problem and came up with a proposed solution.
Yeah. And those people, I remember from the report, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the number was some vendors said they look at 10,000 RFPs per year. And if you can save any amount of time on that initial process, that adds up.
Yeah. And the number I found even grimmer was the vendors reporting that the RFPs that they see are mostly irrelevant to them. And a quarter of vendors said that 90% of the RFPs that they're sent are not relevant to them. that we see government just spamming these things out to any vendor that exists, thinking, well, maybe they'll bid on this. And it's not an irrational tactic on the part of government, but it gets to a point where it's really difficult for vendors to triage what's worth their time and what's not. It'll take testing and research to sort this out. And other organizations, I hope, will dive into that into the months and years ahead. But if you can better target solicitations, and if you can make it easier for vendors to quickly assess, is this for me or no, do you get better bids? And I don't want to say more bids. More bids isn't necessarily good. Do you get better bids from vendors that are more appropriate for that work? And I hope so. I hope that's the outcome, but we won't know that for a long time.
Right. Right. And I'm not sure we explicitly mentioned what we're talking about here. So what was it's a very common sense, straightforward, dare I say, obvious solution. But
it is obvious.
So after this research, what did you come up with?
Yeah, the proposal that the volunteer team came up with is what we wound up calling a summary sheet. And it's just this. The things that just about all vendors told us that they were looking for right up front to make that first blush decision of, should we bother with this? Even should we bother just reviewing it in depth? Well, we made a list of all of those and we put them right on a single sheet. Ideally, it would be the second page in an RFP. So we put that together on a test basis. We doctored up a real RFP that we changed, and we did not tell the next group of user researchers that we'd modified the RFP. And we went to them and had them, as we did with the first group, had them review it and narrate what they were seeing. And I went back and watched one of the recordings a few times. It was pretty funny. This at a smaller vendor with a couple hundred employees, I think. Their capture manager is the person who reviews these as their first line employee. And she's narrating what she's reading. And she's like, yeah, cover sheet. Yeah, some sort of summary, and continues down. And she sort of loses the thread of her thought, because you can tell her remarks, because you can tell she's distracted by, wait, what was that thing? And she scrolls back up to the second page and stops talking and looks at it for like 5 seconds. Doesn't say anything, continues on, goes a few more pages down, and over the next 30 seconds, her remarks become more disjointed and peter out. And she's like, what was that? And scrolls back up again. And then she's like, wait, this is everything we look for in an RFP. It's right here. And on her screen, she shares the checklist that they use internally to evaluate if an RFP is worth their time. And she's saying, this is just our checklist. This is all the stuff we look for. It's just here. It's just on this sheet. This is amazing. I've never seen this. So I think the jig was up at that point. I think she knew that this had been modified, but that was the reaction that we were looking for. And so to be able to validate the team's theory that this might help with testing that with actual vendors was great. And the real proof that it worked well is we had asked, on a 1 to 5 scale, we'd asked the participants to rate the experience of reading the regular solicitation in the first round. And on a grading scale, they gave it a D. And then we asked the same question of the second group that looked at the doctored one. And they gave it, again, adjusted to a grading scale, an A+ in terms of how easy it was to find the information that they were looking for. And you described it as obvious. Absolutely. The idea that you should just take the information that people are looking for and just put it right up front is totally obvious. Right. But procurement shops don't have time for this. They are overwhelmed. There's no time to sit down and conduct user research with vendors about how they feel about the procurement process and how it's working for them. So it's obvious in retrospect, but my sympathies lie with the procurement shops that they don't have time to figure this out.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to drill into that a little bit more, because clearly something is wrong when a person is presented with a sensical solution and something that's useful, and they're dumbfounded. Like, what is this? I'm used to things being, difficult and confusing. Clearly, there's something going wrong there, and all of that. So, you've worked in and around the federal government, and I can't recall if you ever worked in a state government. Maybe you can say
state of Virginia. Yeah.
Oh, right. And so, what do you think? You mentioned, those procurement offices being very busy, obviously not having time to do research. What are the other are there other challenges that you've not that led to this situation, but to actually implementing this? Do you foresee there being challenges, or is this just a matter of maybe just encouragement? What is your anticipation there?
Sure. We didn't do any research into what it would be like to implement this, and included at the end of the document a recommendation for additional research to be performed that we hope some sibling organizations around the country might be willing to pursue. And that's one of the questions: is what are the obstacles to implementing this? One very simple obstacle is there's sort of a locked-in approach to solicitations that a lot of states use, which is to just dust off the last one that you used for something kind of like what you're doing here and Mad Lib it and put in whatever's changed, whatever's different about the solicitation, and issue it. That is the easiest and most straightforward way to ensure that you're using the solicitation that will do what you need to do, because it worked last time. It should work this time too. There's not the room to say, well, can we reconsider our templates? Is there some way we could modify this? So it'll take chief procurement offices in particular, I think, but maybe also state CIOs to intervene and say, can we try this? Can we just drop in this one page and see how that goes? But procurement officials in general are, by the very nature of the job, conservative and cautious. And to say, you should throw an entirely new page in that into the solicitation, nobody's done it before, but maybe it'll work for you. That is not a real compelling offer. They're going to need some data showing that this is useful, and they might need permission from above to say, it's fine. You're just restating what it already says in the RFP. You're just putting on one page. It's okay. But so you're looking at a lot of methodical legal types.
So do you think the concern there would potentially be a legal one, not to do with wasted time or anything like that?
I don't think wasted time is going to be a concern, because it seems to take minutes to put this together. But again, this is where the user research comes in to find out, is it really that fast? Now, I would argue that if an agency is not prepared to provide the very basic information that needs to go on this summary sheet, what are you trying to procure? What's your timeline for it? What's your budget? Just a handful of things like that. If they can't answer that, they probably shouldn't be issuing the solicitation in the first place. But maybe it turns out to be difficult to answer these basic questions. That's a problem. But I think if you're doing anything different anywhere in the procurement and contracting process, that feels risky. The safest thing to do is the way that you've always done it. And that's not a way to ever improve anything. But again, in defense of procurement staff, and I'm a federally certified contracting officer's representative, in defense of procurement staff, their job is to safely, securely deliver the results that are needed for the agency, and not to go experimenting with new things. That's not generally in the job description.
Right. All right. That's great. I've noticed, now this is a little bit of a sideways step here, but based on your, I've noticed since Trump took office that a lot of people who've been working in and around the federal government are, maybe it's a coincidence, are increasingly looking to state and local government to make a difference, to try to improve things. Do you think that, have you noticed that also? Do you imagine there'll be more work in state governments attempting to improve services and so forth?
Sure. I mean, it makes sense that feds would be moving to states because they're being fired. So it couldn't be made more clear to them that they're not welcome in federal government. And so for anybody whose interest is in public service, at that point, state and local governments are the options that remain to them. So folks who are at the U.S. Digital Service and 18F, whose interest is less technology or procurement or user research, and more improving governance through those skills that they have, then I think we're going to see a natural move to subnational governments.
Right. Makes sense to me. I just wanted to get a gut check on that. And yeah, thanks, Waldo. Is there anything that we missed? Is there any other aspect of this research that you think is important for people to know about?
Yeah. User research should be applied to all sorts of aspects to government. All we did was apply the very normal tools of user research with NASIO to a very small aspect of procurement. It's not really within the mission of US Digital Response to do a whole lot more work along these lines. We were able to do it because we had NASIO as a partner. But I think this points to the need for a lot more research into how we can make simple changes to the procurement process, prove it out through user research, that can make procurement work better for everybody. Federal government spends twice as much on procurement as it does on staffing. Like, we spend an enormous amount on procurement. And if you include state governments and the amount spent annually, it's just an absolute mind-boggling amount of numbers spent on procurement. And if we can improve that by 1-2%, and I think we can do better than that, but if we can improve it by 1-2% by these sorts of interventions, we really need to get on that. I am so eager to see other organizations, particularly those that work heavily in procurement at a state level, to pick this up and run with it. And I'm eager to share anything about our findings, our research, any of our note documents, anything whatsoever that might help other organizations advance this work. And then I want to promote what they do with it. There's a lot more to be done here.
That was Waldo Jaquith, USDR. If you haven't already, you can subscribe to the Priorities Podcast at prioritiespodcast.com or on any of the big podcast platforms. And if you enjoyed this episode, please let us know by leaving a comment or a rating or messaging us on social media. This podcast is a production of Scoop News Group in Washington, D.C. Thank you to Adam Butler and Carlin Fisher for their magnificent production work. That's it for this episode. I'm Colin Woods signing off. Thanks for listening.